Just a few short weeks ago, I took a trip down memory lane and showcased my childhood 486 PC, the very machine I grew up with. While it began life as a humble 486, over the years my dad upgraded it quite a bit. In that video, I restored it back to its original glory just as I first remembered it, which left me with quite a few spare parts. And so I thought, I really just don't like having all these extra parts sitting around collecting dust, so I did what any perfectly sane person would do. Buy even more parts, and maybe, just maybe, I went a little overboard. But the result? Building what might just be the ultimate Windows 95 gaming rig. And what better timing, with Microsoft's iconic OS turning 30 years old this year. So let's dive in, build this beast, and see just how far we can push it. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito and welcome to another episode of Retro Renew. So I have quite a few extra parts from my 486 video, and honestly, after making that, I got the retro PC building bug. While I love playing on the old 486 and reliving the early 90s with some Doom and Wolfenstein, yes, Wolfenstein, I know some folks say Wolfenstein, but I'm sorry, that's just how I've always said it. I kind of wanted something a bit more modern. Thankfully, putting all the original parts back into the 486 left me with some extra, and more importantly, more modern parts, of which are perfect for building a Windows 95 gaming rig. And seeing as how we're in the year 2025, nearly 30 years after its release in August of 1995, I think now is the perfect time to do just that. So to start off, let's take inventory of what I actually have before I pull the trigger on some new goodies to complete the project. First up is the motherboard, and to my surprise, I think it's kind of a decent one. The model is a P5TX B Pro Rev 2.0A, which is a mouthful and comes from ECS, or Elite Group Computer Systems, which is still around till this day and apparently is the 5th largest PC motherboard manufacturer behind some of the more recognizable names in the industry. It's a baby AT form factor, boasting a socket 7, which gives us some pretty good options when it comes to CPUs, which we'll come back to in a moment. It comes with 3 16-bit ISA slots, and more importantly, 4 PCI slots, which we'll definitely be taking advantage of when it comes to graphics cards. It also features an Intel 430TX chipset that supports PCI 2.1 as well as USB, which was pretty new at the time. However, I won't actually be using USB in this build. This board is using a BIOS from Award and is dated at 1997, so it would seem that it's a pretty modern board when it comes to the Windows 95 era. And we have a couple of IDE connectors, as well as one for a floppy, so we can attach all of our peripherals. Overall, I think this is a pretty decent board and a good foundation for this project. Anyway, moving on to the CPU, we had this 6x86MX PR233 from Cyrix, which was supposed to be an equivalent to the 233 MHz Pentiums of the day, but this was more of a budget option. These of course required active cooling, so I do have this nice little heatsink with an integrated fan. Now I am getting a bit ahead of myself, but I picked up this 233 MHz Pentium MMX chip, which I'm planning to compare directly to this Cyrix 6x86. On paper, these two are supposed to be equivalent, but we'll see how true that really is. Now when it comes to the RAM, we apparently had about 128 megabytes worth, 2 sticks of 64, which seems pretty overkill for this time period. It's EDO RAM, but the board can also support 2 sticks of SD RAM, which are quite a bit faster. Alright, so the only other leftover parts we have are the CD-ROM drive and the hard drive. The CD-ROM is a 20-speed from Acer and isn't really all that noteworthy. And the hard drive is from Western Digital from their Caviar line with a whopping 4.3 gigabytes of storage. This actually already has Windows 98 installed, but I don't think I'll be using this drive in the final build, which brings me to all the fun new stuff I got to complete the project. So obviously I couldn't finish building this computer with just those parts, so I had to pick up some more. Now when it comes to the hard drive, I actually opted for this 32GB SSD, which is the maximum capacity for Windows 95 using the later OSR2 service pack, which is what I'm planning to install. Now this being an SSD won't lead to any real performance gains, but it will reduce the noise considerably, as these older hard drives from this era definitely are quite chatty. But I know some folks actually kind of like the noise that these produce, as it is a bit nostalgic of this era, but I actually want this to be a somewhat quiet rig. Now to actually get the SSD working, I need a SATA to IDE converter, and I'll be using this one from StarTech, which I've actually used many times on the channel, mostly in a lot of my Xbox videos, so I'm pretty familiar with this little guy. Now at the strong recommendation of iFixRetro, who really helped me out with this build, He suggested getting one of these removable hard drive caddies, and I have to say this thing was an absolute godsend for this project. I'll get into why once we start putting this thing together. Also, it's really just satisfying using the locking latch mechanism, and just the overall aesthetic and convenience alone makes this a very worthwhile addition to the project. Okay, now probably the most exciting parts I acquired for this PC build are the Voodoo graphics cards. I actually had originally picked up this beautiful STB Blackmagic Voodoo 2 card, but a viewer of the channel named James Holden reached out and said he actually had an extra pair. Yeah, you heard me right, he had two Creative 7760 12MB Voodoo 2 cards, which were basically top of the line back in the day. I mean, two Voodoo cards is definitely better than one, right? He gave me an absolutely incredible deal, so I couldn't refuse. And I'm actually really excited to see what these can do when running in parallel via SLI or scanline interweave. We'll get more into that in a little bit. And speaking of which, typically these cards came with a short ribbon cable to connect them together, but I was looking around to see if there was anything more interesting out there to connect the two cards together. I found a few solid options with some 3DFX logos that I initially thought would be great for this build, but I eventually ran across this open source project from Magic Phase, which actually not only has a really cool LED lit Quake logo, but also space for two small 40mm fans to keep the cards actively cooled. This being an open source project, I was actually going to make one on my own, but thankfully I found a seller on eBay that sells these completely assembled. They are a bit pricey at $75 for the Noctua version, but it definitely saves you a ton of time and effort. And so that's what I did. I picked one of these up, and the quality appears to be very nice. I actually made a slight modification by cutting the excess wires for the two fans, which originally were bunched up here in the middle. I just thought this looked a bit cleaner. Now, another really cool thing about the SLI bridge is that the Quake logo also lights up. While RGB lighting is very common in today's computers, back then it totally wasn't. So I thought it'd be cool to add a bit of that RGB flair to this PC build, although the case unfortunately wasn't made to show this off. Now, I didn't know this, but in addition to these 3DFX cards, I actually needed another video card. One to drive the 2D graphical user interface for the Windows 95 operating system. Apparently these cards are only designed for 3D rendering, and I'll need another card to handle all the 2D graphics. So for that, I picked up this 4MB S3 Verge DX card from Diamond, and according to iFix Retro, these are supposed to be the gold standard for these types of cards. For audio, I again took iFix Retro's advice and picked up this absolutely gorgeous Sound Blaster AW64 Gold card. I just hope it sounds as good as it looks because this thing is fancy. They really leaned into the whole gold aesthetic, with gold traces and even gold-plated I/O. I think Goldmember would definitely be a fan.
I love gold!
Anyway, we'll of course need a case to put all these parts in. I was thankfully able to source a baby AT case, which definitely seems to have gotten pretty expensive in recent years. These are generally very generic cases, but I really love the aesthetics. These just remind me so much of the 90s. When it came in, it was super dusty and pretty dirty overall, but I was able to tear it down and give it a deep clean, and I think it cleaned up rather nicely. It thankfully came with a 250 watt power supply, so I'm good in that department, and I was able to actually swap out the original fan with a Noctua one, exactly like I did in my 486 video. So if you're interested in seeing how I did that, I'll leave a timestamp link down below in the video description for you to check out. Now the case also came with a floppy drive, but I also wanted to install a zip drive. This too is a magnetic media, very much like a regular floppy disk, but it has a capacity of 100 megabytes. I remember using these extensively back in the day before USB thumb drives were a thing, and I don't imagine I'll be using this a lot for this project, but I did it mainly for the nostalgia. Okay, so that's pretty much all the parts I'll be using for this build. I do have a small collection of games that I'm excited to try out, some of which are originals from my childhood, and others are ones that I bought recently that I've always wanted to try on the PC. Alright, so we can finally get started building this PC, which brings me to the sponsor of today's video, Linus Tech Tips with their all-new ratcheting screwdriver. This thing is definitely going to come in clutch for this build. Now after using this for a bit, I've got to say, it's quickly become one of my favorite tools. The ratcheting action is super smooth and it gives you just the right amount of control, even when dealing with tiny screws. And it really does save your wrist in the long run with the ratcheting action. The clicks are also really satisfying. And the precision diamond cut knurling on the shaft gives you that extra grip and precision when you need it most. There's also a really convenient hidden bit storage compartment inside of the handle, with a really slick spring-loaded action when you open and close it. It holds a full set of 12 high-quality bits, and the magnet inside the shaft is strong enough to keep them locked in tight. and even pick up loose screws with ease. And that ergonomic 3-lobe handle, it just feels great in the hand. Honestly, it's the perfect companion for building PCs like this one, and you can really tell it's well built from the materials they use and the satisfying heft when holding it in your hand. So definitely check out the ratcheting screwdriver over at the LTT store. I've got it linked down below in the video description. Huge thanks to Linus Tech Tips for sponsoring this video and for making a tool that's genuinely awesome to use. Alright, so the first thing I want to start off with is actually replacing the tiny cooling fan that came with the hard drive caddy. When I did a test build to make sure all the components were in good working order, I noticed that this tiny fan made quite a bit of noise. I'm going to replace it with a 40mm Noctua fan, which should fit perfectly. Unfortunately though, the connector is quite different, so what I'm going to do is trim off the connector on the Noctua fan and also trim off the connector on the original fan. The idea is to splice in the original connector onto the Noctua. Simply strip the wires and then solder them together as shown. And to prevent any potential shorting, definitely use something like heat shrink tubing. And you should be left with a Noctua fan that can be easily plugged into our caddy and hopefully will keep the noise levels to a minimum. Okay, this is looking pretty good. This should be the only soldering I do for the entire project, but I think it's going to be worth it at the end to keep the build somewhat silent. Anyway, since we are working on the caddy, let's go ahead and install the SSD inside. Just grab the IDE to SATA adapter and plug it into the IDE connector inside. Then to power the SSD, we'll need to connect the Molex from the adapter to the one coming from the caddy itself. And then all that's left to do is plug in our 32GB SSD. Sweet, now all we need to do is close up the caddy, and then insert it back into the base. Alright, next we're going to go ahead and grab the PC case and start to populate all the drives, starting with the hard drive caddy. Then we'll put in the CD-ROM, then the floppy drive, and then the zip drive. I decided to also put in the original hard drive, even though I won't be using it, but I like the idea of keeping it with the original computer parts. Now I'm going to go ahead and secure all the drives with some screws. I'm doing this at this stage since once the motherboard is installed, I won't be able to access some of the screws, especially the ones on the opposite side of the case. As I screw each one in, I make sure that each drive is flush with the front face of the case, that way everything looks nice and clean. To access the other side of the drive bay, I do need to remove this panel, which is actually where we'll be mounting the motherboard here in a moment. This panel does block access to the drive cage from the outside, which is exactly why I'm taking care of installing all of the drives now. Okay, so all the drives are now installed. Let's go ahead and take care of the motherboard. This panel, which the motherboard mounts to, comes with 2 brass standoffs as well as 2 plastic ones pre-installed, and they actually line up pretty much perfectly with the mounting holes on the motherboard. So we'll go ahead and place it over top, and then just snap it in place. And then we'll go ahead and secure it to the 2 brass standoffs. Next, we'll go ahead and drop in my 2 sticks of EDO RAM, which again is about 128 megabytes worth. Let me know if you think that's a bit overkill for this project. It does seem pretty high, especially when I look at the system requirements for some of these games. Alright, so the motherboard is already configured for the Cyrix 6x86 processor, but I'll be swapping in the Pentium MMX a bit later to run a performance comparison. Like I mentioned before, the Cyrix chip is supposed to be the equivalent of a 233 MHz Pentium, but we'll see if that really holds up to that claim. Now you might notice that I spliced in some DuPont wires here. This was to shorten the length of the fan cable. Originally, the CPU fan came with a very long Molex connector, but since this motherboard has a fan header conveniently located right next to the CPU socket, wiring it directly here just made everything look a lot cleaner. So the motherboard is pretty much prepped at this point, so we can go ahead and install it back into the case. It slides right in, and it secures with 2 screws. The motherboard actually came with 2 rear I/O connectors. One has a PS2 port for a mouse as well as a parallel port, and the other has a serial port. Now the ribbon cables attached to these are pretty long, and they really start to kind of get in the way once I begin hooking up all the drives. So one of the main goals I have with this build is cable management. I ended up using a bunch of zip ties to keep everything under control, but for all you retro PC builders out there, let me know what you use for cable management, because honestly, dealing with the wiring in these old systems can be a real headache. Anyway, now I'm just going ahead to wire everything to power, trying my hardest to keep everything nice and tidy. Next, I'm going to go ahead and connect all the various front panel LED indicators, buttons, as well as the internal speaker. Most of them go here to these headers right next to the CPU, with the exception of the hard drive activity LED, which goes here just off camera behind the CPU. And in my ongoing battle with cable management, I bundled up the excess wires with a zip tie and tucked them into this little fixture here in the front part of the case. It looks like it was meant for an optional internal fan, but it turns out to be the perfect spot to stash all the extra cables to keep them out of the way. Alright, now we get to what I guess you could call the fun part of the build, installing all of the expansion cards. First up is the Sound Blaster card. I popped this one into the bottom ISA slot. Next to go in is the S3 Verge, which I'm going to be putting in the top PCI slot. There's no real strict layout that I'm following here, but when it comes to installing the Voodoo cards, I do have to avoid the very lowest PCI slot, since that one runs into the edge of the CPU heatsink, so it's a no-go. And I do have these extra I/O covers, which I'm placing in the remaining 2 open slots to cover them up. Alright, now it's time to connect the 2 Voodoo cards using this really sweet looking SLI bridge. One thing to keep in mind though is that I've left the Voodoo cards slightly loose, since the bridge does require a fixed distance between them. Once the bridge is installed and everything nicely lines up, then I can go ahead and tighten down the screws to lock in the card securely. And of course, don't forget to connect the 2 fans to power. My motherboard thankfully has another set of fan headers that's pretty much perfectly placed right by the CPU. And I think that's pretty much it. Now let's go ahead and head over to the studio and see if this thing powers on, and then also get it ready for a fresh install of Windows 95. Now since we have these separate Voodoo cards installed, we actually need to pass the 2D video from the S3 Verge into one of these Voodoo cards, and we're going to do that with a short VGA cable. So with that done, and after hooking everything else up, we've reached the moment of truth. Let's see if she'll power on. Okay, everything's looking pretty good. Now, I don't know about you, but I think, at least aesthetically, this thing looks pretty awesome. But more importantly than how it looks is if it works. And upon booting up, we can see that the CPU and all of the RAM is recognized, and oddly enough, it actually looks like there's 130 megabytes of RAM and not 128. And it did also see the SSD, which is a very good sign. So before we can install Windows, we actually need to initialize the SSD first. I thankfully had this Windows 98 boot disk that my dad made from way back, which actually allows me to run the fdisk utility and create a DOS partition on the SSD. So this does take a bit of time, but we'll just go ahead and fast forward through it. Once it's done, we now need to go ahead and format the new partition. Now I'm going to format the drive using the format command, which will give us a blank slate to copy all of our Windows operating system files to. Okay, so now this is where that removable bay comes in handy. After turning the computer off, we can take it out and then remove the SSD. I have one of these USB to SATA connectors, which easily allows me to connect it to my computer. Once the SSD is connected, it shows up like any old regular drive. I've already got all my Windows 95 files ready to go on my desktop, including the OS itself, the necessary drivers, and even Unreal Tournament, which I'm going to be using a bit later for some benchmarking. For now, I'm just dragging and dropping the Windows 95 setup files onto the SSD. I've named the folder simply 95 to avoid any naming conflicts during installation. And as always, I've dropped a link in the video description if you want to grab the same setup files that I have. So once those files are copied over to the SSD, just put it back into the caddy and then reinsert it into the computer. With the computer on, we're going to go ahead and change directory to the 95 folder that we copied over. And then I'm going to start the setup process using the setup/is command, which skips the ScanDisk utility, which can take a few hours to run. And it jumps right into copying all the necessary files for installing Windows 95. From here, it's just a matter of following the on-screen prompts until Windows is fully installed. I've got to give a huge shout out again to iFixRetro for helping me through this whole installation process, as he made it super easy to follow. Anyway, now it's time to install all the drivers to get the Voodoo card, Sound Blaster, and S3 Verge working properly. I grabbed most of these drivers from Phil's Computer Lab, so huge shout out to Phil for his incredible website, which is a fantastic resource for those wanting to get into retro computing. Since I didn't have the original installation disk, I went with the fast Voodoo drivers that he had on his site. Okay, after rebooting the computer, it looks like it does recognize all of our cards. I see the 2 Voodoo cards, our AW64 sound card, and the S3 Verge. And if we go into the display properties and look at the system information under the 3DFX tab, we can see that the Scanline Interweave or SLI feature has been recognized, meaning both of our Voodoo cards seem to be working perfectly, which is fantastic. So that means we can now install some games. I actually still have some of the original games from my childhood that my mom thankfully stored and kept safe all these years. I have titles like the original Quake, MechWarrior 2, Quake 3 Arena, Myst, and Command & Conquer. I played the heck out of these games when I was younger, but I did also want to pick up a few other games that I really wanted to play from this era. One was Blade Runner, and the other Final Fantasy VIII, so I found some copies for a good price on eBay and picked them up. Now I did also install Unreal Tournament, which I was able to get online, and while the game was never really on my radar when I was a kid, I will be using it mostly as a way to sort of benchmark the system, since the game does allow you to see the frames per second. I'm very interested in seeing how the Cyrix CPU compares to the Pentium, which I will be swapping in here in just a minute. So yeah, with Unreal installed, I was actually pretty impressed with how well it was running during the opening sequence. For the most part, it felt really smooth, though it did sputter here and there. The actual gameplay for the most part also ran really smooth. I'm running the game at the default 640 by 480 resolution, and I'd say that the performance was pretty good. Anyway, let's give Quake a try. Man, I gotta say I'm actually really impressed with how well this runs. I don't think I've ever seen it run this smoothly. Now, funny story about Quake, my dad and I were huge Doom fans, so when Quake was announced, we were pretty hyped. I remember we even downloaded the demo off the internet, which was kind of a new thing back then, and we actually had to let it download overnight since we had dial-up internet, and I think at the time we had a 56K modem, but it actually might have been a 28.8. Either way, my mind was absolutely blown that we actually played a game that we downloaded from the internet. It must have been like 20 megabytes, but it literally took all night to download. Still, after playing the demo, we were hooked, and when the full game did come out eventually, I remember we went to Sam's Club to pick it up, and this is the actual original copy that we bought from Sam's Club. And Sam's Club, for those who don't know, is basically like Costco. Okay, so let's give Quake 3 Arena a try. Now this game I bought, I think, probably when we got our Gateway PC, which I'm like 80% sure was a Pentium 4. I can't really remember, so I'm kind of shocked at how well this is running on this computer, which is using a regular Cyrix chip. I don't know how graphically intensive the game is, but I do think the Cyrix and Voodoo cards are doing a pretty good job. The game is extremely playable, although I do notice some screen tearing, but it doesn't really affect gameplay at all. Now, MechWarrior 2 was one of those games I totally remember buying just because of the cover art. But as soon as I started playing it again here on this build, I was like, oh right, that's why I never got into it. The controls just felt super clunky and kind of overwhelming. I probably owe it another shot and should spend some real time with it, but I'm curious, did any of you play this game back in the day? Is it worth diving into? Let me know down below in the comments. Alright, so Myst is one of those games that I got really into and poured a lot of hours in, but actually never finished the game. It's certainly not graphically intensive since it's just one of those point and click style games, but man, I remember thinking this game was so cool back in the day. Now, Command & Conquer is a game that I also really got into, and one of my good friends, Simeon, I do remember let me borrow the expansion for this, which was called Red Alert, and I also do remember really enjoying that. This is really the only RTS I ever got into, as I never got into Warcraft or Starcraft, but Command & Conquer was peak Westwood Studios in my book. And speaking of Westwood Studios, we have Blade Runner, which is one of my all-time favorite movies. This was another title from the company that I really wanted to play back in the day. Another good buddy of mine named Sam was really into this when it first came out, and I do remember there being a ton of hype around this game, but for whatever reason, I never picked it up. So hey, maybe now's a good time as any to finally give it a shot. It appears to be a more graphically intensive point and click type game with those classic pre-rendered backgrounds, so I think it'll be pretty interesting to dive into. Now the last game I wanted to play also surprisingly gave me the most trouble, Final Fantasy VIII. I think it's pretty cool that Eidos published these games for the PC, and I remember wanting to get this really bad, and also Final Fantasy VII because that was also released for the PC, because I actually didn't have a PlayStation back then. But as you can see here, the FMVs are running pretty choppy, and here, have a listen. So I have the videos being played at full resolution, but if I lower it, it does perform a lot better. I'm wondering what the actual bottleneck is because according to the system requirements, my setup should be more than adequate to handle the game. We'll see if the Pentium will fix this because other than that, it does appear to run okay, although it did crash on me once. Alright, so let's go ahead and pop in the Pentium CPU and see if there's any kind of noticeable performance boost. Now, the Socket 7 setup makes it super easy to swap out the Cyrix and then drop in the Pentium. Now, it's not strictly necessary, but I went ahead and added a bit of thermal compound, some thermal grizzly, which is definitely overkill for this kind of build, but hey, I think the Pentium's gonna stay in here for the long haul, so I decided to put some in. Of course, it's not just a matter of swapping in the CPU. I also had to adjust the jumpers on the board for the Pentium specifically. Thankfully, my mom actually kept the original manual for the motherboard, and big thanks to Chris over at Displaced Gamers for helping me figure out the exact jumper configuration that I needed. Okay, with everything all set up, let's fire it up again. And the computer recognizes the new Pentium CPU, which is fantastic. So once we're back into Windows, I decided to load Unreal back up, and to my surprise, I didn't really notice any perceivable improvement. Honestly, the gameplay felt pretty much the same as when I had the Cyrix CPU installed. But I didn't want to go by feeling, so instead let's take a look at the numbers. I ran the intro sequence with the FPS on display, and it does appear that there is a performance improvement. If you look at the frames per second on the Pentium here on the right side, you can see that they are consistently higher than the FPS on the Cyrix, which is on the left. I wish I could get like an average FPS readout, but unfortunately the version of Unreal that I have only shows the live FPS count, but we can still see that there is a general higher FPS with the Pentium. The only other test I wanted to run was to see if the Final Fantasy VIII opening FMV was still choppy at full resolution. And yeah, while it might be slightly better, it's still definitely very, very choppy. If anyone out there knows what could be causing that, drop a comment down below and let me know because I'd love to get this sorted. Anyway, I would call this build pretty much done, but as a finishing touch, I gotta put on these badges from Geekenspiel. Since I've decided to stick with the Pentium, I'll be slapping on that badge, at least for the moment, but I did also grab the Cyrix one, just in case I ever want to swap it back in. And of course, I gotta throw on the obligatory Windows 95, Voodoo, and Sound Blaster stickers, because how else is anyone gonna know what kind of firepower I got under the hood? All kidding aside, I gotta say I am really happy with how this build turned out. I threw on this really awesome Sonic wallpaper that I found, and honestly it gives me some major Microsoft vibes. Something about the overall style, with the fact that Sonic is carrying a briefcase, and that 90s aesthetic just really works well for this project. Anyway, I think I'm gonna have a ton of fun with this rig. Let me know what you all think of the build, what you liked, what you would have changed, or anything I should upgrade. And definitely drop me your game recommendations in the comments. Huge shout out to Linus Tech Tips for sponsoring this video, and most importantly, big thanks to all of you for tuning in and watching. Be sure to check out my second channel for more retro gaming and modding stuff, and I'll catch you in the next one.